The frozen winds howled through the dense pine forest as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snowy ground. Thorvald stood atop a rocky outcrop, his figure outlined by the pale light of the full moon that hung high above. His long dark hair whipped in the wind, and his cloak billowed behind him like the banner of a warrior preparing for battle. His hand rested on the hilt of his axe, a weapon forged for the gods themselves. "They will come," he muttered to himself, his voice low but resolute. "The ones who seek to end us." His brother Sigvard appeared beside him, his face hard as stone. "Then we shall meet them in the valley," Sigvard said, his eyes narrowing. "We will not be broken." Thorvald turned to face him, his brow furrowed with the weight of their journey ahead. "We fight not for survival, but for our legacy," Thorvald replied. The two brothers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The battle was coming, and they were ready. The moon rose higher in the sky as Thorvald and Sigvard descended the rocky outcrop, their destination now clear. The sound of the wind was replaced by the crunch of snow beneath their boots. "We must reach the village before the storm arrives," Thorvald said, his voice low and determined. Sigvard nodded, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The traitors will be there," he replied, his tone laced with urgency. "But so will the raiders." Thorvald's grip on his axe tightened. "We need allies. Without them, we stand little chance." They continued their march through the snow, the cold biting at their faces. The forest around them seemed alive, shadows moving as the wind howled through the branches. They had no choice but to trust the villagers. The battle ahead would determine not just their fate, but the fate of their people. As they neared the village, the first signs of a storm began to appear on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and danger. "It's coming," Sigvard said, his voice tense. "The raiders will strike soon." Thorvald nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the village. "We must be ready," he replied. As they approached the gates, they could see the villagers huddling together, preparing for the storm. Their faces were filled with fear and uncertainty. "We need to act now," Thorvald said, his voice firm. "Gather the warriors, we fight tonight." The gates creaked open, and the brothers entered the village, their presence immediately commanding attention. The villagers, though wary, gathered around them. "We've come for your help," Thorvald said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The raiders are close, and if we don't unite, they'll wipe us out." The chief of the village, an older man with a long beard and a hardened gaze, stepped forward. "We've seen the raiders before," he said. "They won't hesitate to burn everything we've built." Thorvald met his gaze. "Then we fight together," he declared. "We will show them the strength of the North." The villagers murmured among themselves, but the chief nodded slowly. "We will stand with you," he said. "Tonight we fight." Night had fallen, and the storm was upon them. The wind howled as Thorvald and the villagers prepared for battle. The raiders were close, their war cries carried on the wind. "This is it," Thorvald said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "They're here." Sigvard stepped forward, his sword drawn. "We'll hold the gates," he said. "You and the chief take the flanks." Thorvald nodded, and with a final glance at the village, he turned to the chief. "Let's make this night one they'll never forget." The battle began as the raiders charged toward the village, and the sound of clashing steel filled the night. The clash of steel against steel echoed through the storm, the battle raging fiercely outside the village gates. Thorvald swung his axe with brutal precision, cutting down another raider who had tried to break through the line. His eyes were wild with the rush of battle, but his mind remained clear. He needed to end this quickly. The raiders were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. "Push them back," Thorvald shouted to the villagers, his voice booming over the chaos. Sigvard was beside him, his sword flashing as he cut down another attacker. "We can't hold much longer," Sigvard yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Thorvald turned his gaze toward the village, seeing the smoke rising from the roofs. The raiders were setting fire to the huts. His anger flared. We fight till the last breath, he roared. For the village. With renewed fury, Thorvald swung his axe again, cutting through the chaos like a storm. The battle seemed endless. Thorvald's muscles ached, his breath ragged in the freezing air as he cleaved through the enemy ranks. He could see the raider leader in the distance, a massive figure standing tall amid his followers, directing the attack with cruel precision. There! Thorvald shouted, pointing toward the leader. That's where the heart of this fight lies. Sigvard nodded, his expression grim. If we take him down, the rest will fall back. The two brothers pushed through the melee, cutting down any who dared to stand in their way. As they neared the leader, the raiders seemed to sense their intent and closed in, but Thorvald was unstoppable. With a swift, powerful strike, he cut through the raiders and reached the leader. The man sneered, raising his massive sword to meet Thorvald's blow. You think you can defeat me? The leader growled. I am death itself. Thorvald's eyes burned with determination. I am vengeance, he replied. The raider leader's eyes glinted with malice as he swung his great sword at Thorvald, forcing him to leap back. You're stronger than I thought, the leader snarled, eyeing Thorvald with a mixture of contempt and admiration. Thorvald gritted his teeth, his muscles sore from the battle, but his resolve was unshaken. You'll fall like the rest, Thorvald growled, meeting the leader's attack with a defiant swing of his axe. The clash of their weapons rang out across the battlefield, the leader's strength putting Thorvald on the defensive. Sigvard was at his side in an instant, flanking the leader. Together, they pressed forward, their movements synchronized. We take him down together, Sigvard said, his voice low. Thorvald nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. With a well-timed strike, Sigvard distracted the leader, and Thorvald took the opportunity to drive his axe deep into the raider's side. The leader staggered back, but he wasn't finished yet. With a final roar, Thorvald thrust his axe deep into the raider leader's chest. The impact sent a shock through his body, and the leader's once fiery eyes dulled as he fell to the snow. It is done, Thorvald said quietly, watching as the last remnants of the leader's life drained away. Sigvard let out a breath, his sword dripping with blood, and glanced at Thorvald. The battle isn't over though, he said, looking at the remaining raiders. They'll retreat, but only for a moment. Thorvald nodded, his chest heaving with exhaustion. We've earned a moment of peace, but we cannot stop, not until every last one of them is gone. He turned toward the villagers, rallying them. The fight is not won, but we have struck at the heart. We can finish this. The villagers, emboldened by the fall of the leader, rallied together. With renewed courage, Thorvald and Sigvard led them to finish what they had started. The raiders had been pushed back, their numbers dwindling as the villagers, led by Thorvald and Sigvard, dealt the final blows. The battlefield fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of the distant fires. Thorvald stood among the wreckage, his body bruised and bloodied, but his spirit unbroken. He looked out over the snow-covered battlefield, taking in the sight of the fallen warriors on both sides. We've won this battle, he said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. But there are more battles ahead. We cannot rest. Sigvard stood beside him, his hand on Thorvald's shoulder. For the people of this land, Sigvard replied. We will fight for them. Thorvald turned to face the villagers, his gaze hardening once more. Tonight we celebrate. Tomorrow we rebuild. And we prepare for whatever comes next. With that, the villagers began to regroup, tending to the wounded and preparing for the future. The storm may have passed, but the battle was far from over. The next morning, the village was quiet, a haunting stillness hanging over the aftermath of the battle. Thorvald stood at the edge of the village, gazing over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, but the scars of the night before were clear. The bodies of the fallen raiders had been gathered and burned, their ashes scattered in the wind. The villagers were beginning to rebuild, but there was an air of uncertainty that lingered. We may have won this fight, Thorvald said, his voice low, but the war is far from over. Sigvard joined him, his armor now repaired, but his expression dark. There is always another raid, Sigvard replied. They won't stop, and neither can we. Thorvald turned to his brother, his jaw clenched. We need to find out who's behind these raids. This doesn't end with this group. There's someone pulling the strings and we need to stop them before it's too late. Sigvard nodded, his eyes hard with determination. Then we leave at first light. We find them. The days following the battle were spent preparing for the journey ahead. Thorvald and Sigvard, with a small group of warriors, gathered their supplies and readied their horses for the long trek into the wilderness. The villagers had offered their thanks, but the brothers knew their duty was far from done. We track them down, we end them, Thorvald muttered as he packed his gear, his thoughts focused on the path that lay ahead. Sigvard looked over at him, his expression resolute. We don't know what we're walking into, but it's the only way to protect the villages. Thorvald nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his axe. We'll find their camp, uncover their leader, and when we do, we strike swiftly. As the warriors mounted their horses and rode out, the village behind them grew smaller, disappearing into the snow-covered horizon. The journey would be long, and the dangers unknown, but Thorvald felt the weight of his purpose, pushing him forward into the unknown. The journey through the snow-covered forests was treacherous. The cold seemed to bite deeper with each passing day, and the trail they followed grew faint. Thorvald's mind raced as they pressed forward, his thoughts torn between the villagers' safety and the mystery behind the raider attacks. We're close, Sigvard said, breaking the silence. He pointed toward the horizon, where a dark shape loomed. There's something out there. A camp, maybe. Thorvald squinted, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the distance. It could be a trap, he warned, his voice low. We need to approach with caution. As they neared the camp, they could see the smoke rising in the distance. The camp was hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by tall trees and mist. It was eerily quiet, and Thorvald felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They would need to be prepared for whatever lay ahead. The camp was larger than Thorvald had expected, with several tents and a large bonfire at the center. Shadows moved in the distance, and the smell of cooked meat wafted through the air. There are more of them than we thought, Sigvard whispered, his eyes narrowing. Thorvald motioned for the group to dismount and approach silently. We move in under the cover of darkness, he instructed. As they crouched low and moved closer, the sounds of laughter and conversation reached their ears. They could hear a voice speaking loudly, commanding the others. He's here, Thorvald muttered. The leader. Sigvard gave a sharp nod. We take him tonight. The brothers moved swiftly, their hearts pounding as they approached the bonfire. They had no time to waste, their enemy was right in front of them. Thorvald's heart raced as they neared the leader's tent. They had infiltrated the camp with silent precision, but the moment of truth was fast approaching. The raider leader was inside the largest tent, surrounded by his most trusted men. Thorvald signaled to Sigvard, who nodded silently. We go in, we strike fast, Thorvald whispered, his voice low and determined. They drew their weapons, ready for the confrontation. With one swift motion, they entered the tent. The raider leader looked up in surprise, his hand reaching for his weapon. You think you can defeat me? He sneered. I am the storm that crushes everything in its path. Thorvald's eyes burned with fury. You're nothing but a shadow, he growled. The brothers charged, their weapons flashing in the dim light as they clashed with the leader and his men. The air was thick with the sound of clashing steel, and the smell of blood soon filled the tent. The raider leader's roar of fury filled the tent as Thorvald and Sigvard closed in. Their axes and swords clashed with the leader's heavy sword, sparks flying from the contact. You will die like the rest, the leader bellowed, his strength evident in every swing. Thorvald's muscles burned, but he held his ground, parrying the leader's blows with a fierce determination. Sigvard struck from the side, his sword cutting through the air. The leader grinned, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. You think you can defeat me in my own camp? The leader sneered. Thorvald's eyes narrowed. You're nothing but a coward hiding behind your men, he spat. With a swift movement, Sigvard struck, distracting the leader long enough for Thorvald to land a fatal blow. The leader staggered, his expression one of disbelief, and fell to the ground with a resounding thud. The camp fell silent, the raider forces realizing their leader had fallen. With the leader dead, the remaining raiders hesitated, their morale shattered by the sudden loss. Thorvald wiped the blood from his face, his gaze sweeping over the fallen enemy soldiers. "We've taken their leader, now we finish the rest," he said, his voice cold and commanding. Sigvard nodded, wiping his sword clean. "They will scatter now. The fear will take hold." Thorvald looked toward the entrance of the tent, where the sounds of the battle outside began to dwindle. The raiders without their leader would falter. "Hold the line," he called out to his men, "and don't let any of them escape." With a final look at the leader's body, Thorvald turned and marched toward the exit, his warriors following in his wake. The camp was theirs, but Thorvald knew they couldn't rest yet. There was still much to do. The battle outside was winding down. The remaining raiders, leaderless and broken, were quickly dispatched by Thorvald's warriors. Thorvald stood at the edge of the camp, watching the last of the raiders flee into the forest. The snow was stained with blood, and the wind carried the scent of fire and death. "We've done it," Sigvard said, coming up beside him, his voice tired but satisfied. Thorvald's eyes never left the fleeing raiders. "They're scattered, but they'll regroup. We've only delayed the inevitable." Sigvard glanced at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "There's more to this," Thorvald replied, his voice cold. "A single raid is no accident. Someone is pulling the strings behind these attacks, and we need to find them." Sigvard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll hunt them down, no matter where they go." Thorvald turned to face his brother, his jaw set in determination. "We end this now." The decision was made. Thorvald and Sigvard gathered the survivors from the village and their warriors, preparing for their next move. They would not return home until they had discovered the true enemy. Thorvald stood before the assembled group, his voice commanding as he spoke. "The battle is over, but the war is far from won. We must leave no stone unturned. Whoever is behind these raids will pay the price." Sigvard nodded beside him. "We'll search the forest, the mountains, and beyond. We will not rest until we know who we are truly fighting." One of the villagers stepped forward, a worried look on his face. "But where do we start?" Thorvald's eyes hardened as he surveyed the group. "We start at the source. We follow their trail wherever it leads." With a unified nod, the group began to prepare for the journey. There would be no turning back now. The group traveled for days, their journey taking them deep into the mountains. The air grew thinner, the landscape more treacherous, and the days grew shorter as the harsh winter tightened its grip. Yet, Thorvald pushed forward, his resolve unshaken. "We're close," he said one evening, his eyes scanning the rugged terrain. Sigvard, walking beside him, nodded. "We've seen signs of movement. They're near." As the group climbed higher, the snow grew deeper, and the wind howled through the peaks. "We must stay sharp," Thorvald warned. "One mistake, and it could be our last." The warriors tightened their grips on their weapons, their faces hardened by the cold and the weight of the task ahead. As they approached a narrow pass, Thorvald's instincts flared. "This is it," he said. "They're waiting for us." The narrow pass opened up into a vast valley, and in the distance Thorvald could see a large camp, smoke rising from the bonfires. The camp was well hidden within the mountain range, surrounded by jagged cliffs that made it nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "This is it," Thorvald muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The heart of their operation. Sigvard scanned the camp with a sharp eye. "Looks like they've been here a while. We'll need to move carefully." The group continued forward, but Thorvald's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He had tracked these raiders for weeks, and now the time had come to confront the source of their endless raids. "We can't wait any longer," Thorvald said, his voice hard with resolve. "We go in at dawn." As the dawn broke, the camp came to life, the raiders stirring from their tents and gathering around the bonfires. Thorvald and his group crouched in the snow, watching from a concealed position. "Now's our chance," Sigvard whispered, his voice low. Thorvald nodded. We wait for the signal. One wrong move and we'll be swarmed. They had planned their attack carefully, silent, swift, and brutal. The camp was a hive of activity, but Thorvald knew that the moment they struck, chaos would erupt. He could already feel the tension building in his chest. They'll regret ever crossing our path, Thorvald muttered, his hand tightening on the axe. As the first raiders started to separate from the main group, Thorvald signaled. Move out, he commanded. The group surged forward like wolves, closing in on their prey. The attack was swift, like a wave crashing upon the shore. Thorvald's warriors poured into the camp, axes and swords raised. The raiders were caught off guard, their morning routines shattered by the sound of battle. Thorvald charged into the fray, his axe swinging with deadly precision. For the village, he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. Sigvard fought beside him, his sword flashing in the early light as he cleaved through the enemy ranks. The camp erupted in confusion, raiders scrambling for weapons and trying to rally. Thorvald moved through the chaos with a single-minded purpose. He had to reach the leader. Find him, Thorvald shouted to Sigvard, his voice full of urgency. End this. Sigvard nodded, cutting down another raider as he moved toward the center of the camp. Thorvald pushed forward, his eyes locked on the target. Thorvald reached the center of the camp, his axe dripping with the blood of his enemies. The leader's tent loomed ahead, guarded by a handful of raiders who were quickly dispatched by Thorvald's warriors. He kicked the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the raider leader stood, a grim smile on his face as he raised his massive sword. So, the great Thorvald finally shows his face. The leader sneered, his voice full of malice. You think you can defeat me in my own camp? Thorvald's eyes burned with fury. You've already lost, he said, stepping forward. The raider leader charged, but Thorvald was faster. With a swift, brutal strike, he cut through the leader's defense and struck him down. The raider leader fell to the ground with a heavy thud, his sword slipping from his grasp. Wah! Thorvald stood over him, his chest heaving. This is the end. With the leader dead and the camp in disarray, Thorvald surveyed the aftermath. The raiders who had survived were either captured or fleeing into the mountains, and the once proud camp was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. We've done it, Sigvard said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. They'll think twice before attacking again. Thorvald looked at the burning camp, his expression hard. This was only one camp, he said. There are more. We'll have to hunt them down one by one. Sigvard nodded. We'll need to regroup and plan our next move. Thorvald's gaze lingered on the smoldering fires, his mind already turning to the future. We'll take them all down, he muttered, more to himself than to his brother. Every last one of them. As they gathered their warriors, Thorvald knew this was just the beginning of a much larger war, and they would stop at nothing to see it through. The following days were filled with quiet preparation. Thorvald and his warriors had gathered the survivors from the raid, and together they began to map their next move. The mountains had proven treacherous, but they were making progress. We can't afford to rest too long, Thorvald said, standing by a campfire with Sigvard at his side. The firelight danced across his weathered face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the resolve in his eyes. There are more camps, more leaders to find. Sigvard leaned on his sword, his posture weary but unwavering. You think they're all connected? That someone's orchestrating this? Thorvald nodded grimly. I do. Whoever controls these raiders is still out there, and I intend to find him. Sigvard watched the flames flicker, the weight of the task settling over him. Then we keep moving, he said quietly. No matter what it takes. The journey continued through the rugged mountains, the snow growing thicker and the cold more biting with each passing day. As the days dragged on, Thorvald's resolve never wavered. We'll find them, he muttered to himself, eyes scanning the barren landscape. Sigvard was beside him, his movements slower but still determined. You're sure they'll be here? This far into the mountains? Sigvard asked. Thorvald glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. They've been moving through these lands for weeks. There's nowhere left for them to hide. Sigvard nodded, adjusting the fur cloak around his shoulders. Then we find them, and we end this. The wind howled through the peaks as they pressed on, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the thick snow. Thorvald's heart beat faster as they neared their goal, knowing that the final confrontation was drawing closer. They came upon the raider camp at dusk, the low light of the setting sun casting a red glow over the mountains. Thorvald motioned for his group to stop. Ahead, they could see the smoke rising from several large tents. "This is it," Thorvald whispered, his voice low. "The heart of their operation." Sigvard nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We've got the element of surprise." The group moved in closer, their steps silent in the snow. As they neared the camp, the sounds of laughter and shouting reached their ears. Thorvald motioned for everyone to stay low, and they carefully circled around to the back of the camp. The sound of raiders celebrating their latest victory echoed in the air. "Let's finish this," Thorvald murmured, his hand tightening on his axe. They were ready, and this time, there would be no escaping the wrath of the North. The attack was swift and brutal. Thorvald led the charge, his axe swinging through the air as he cleaved through the first wave of raiders. The sound of steel ringing against steel filled the air, and the raiders scrambled to defend themselves. Sigvard was beside him, cutting down enemies with lethal precision. "For the village!" Thorvald shouted, his voice full of fury. His warriors surged forward, overwhelming the raiders in the camp. It was chaos. Raiders clashed with villagers and Thorvald's men. But the Northmen fought with a fierceness born of necessity. As the raiders fell, Thorvald and Sigvard pushed toward the center of the camp, where they could see the leader standing, eyes full of malice. "You will not defeat me," the leader shouted, raising his weapon high. Thorvald's eyes burned with hatred. "You will fall like all the rest," he spat, charging forward. The leader's final stand was fierce, but it was not enough. Thorvald's axe struck true, cutting down the last of the resistance. The leader, his face twisted in rage, fell to his knees before Thorvald. "You will regret this," the leader hissed, blood spilling from his wounds. Thorvald stood over him, his axe raised high. "No," Thorvald said coldly. "You're the one who will regret this." With a single blow, the leader's life was ended. The camp fell silent. The fight was over. The surviving raiders scattered, fleeing into the mountains, while Thorvald and his warriors stood victorious. Sigvard approached him, his face weary but satisfied. "It's done," Sigvard said. Thorvald nodded, his gaze hardening as he looked around the camp. "The battle is won, but the war is far from over. We find the ones who sent them. We bring them justice." With that, the group began to prepare for the journey back, knowing the true enemy was still out there waiting. The days that followed the battle were spent tending to the wounded and fortifying the village. Thorvald stood in the center of the village, the wind sweeping through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow. He could see the villagers working together, rebuilding what had been destroyed. But despite the victory, his mind was heavy. "We've driven them back," Sigvard said, approaching Thorvald with a serious expression. "But there are more out there, more waiting for us to slip up." Thorvald nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know," he said quietly. "But we've learned something. The raids are just the beginning. Whoever is behind this has a much larger plan." Sigvard turned to him, his expression concerned. "What's the next step?" Thorvald clenched his fist. "We take the fight to them. We find their stronghold, and we end this once and for all." The next morning, Thorvald and his warriors gathered once more, ready to set out on the journey to track down the ones behind the raids. Their provisions were packed, and their weapons sharpened. The sun barely rose over the horizon, casting a pale light over the snow. "We head north," Thorvald said, his voice steady. "Through the mountains and into the forests. That's where they'll be hiding." Sigvard adjusted his armor and looked up at the sky. "You're sure they'll be there? The tracks have been hard to follow." Thorvald nodded. "They're getting bolder. They want us to follow them so we'll be easy to find. but we'll turn the tables. Sigvard smiled grimly. Then let's go. Time to make them regret ever setting foot in our lands. With that, the group mounted their horses, setting off into the wilderness, the chill of the wind biting at their faces. The journey through the mountains was grueling, the wind whipping at their faces, and the snow growing deeper as they ascended. Thorvald led the way, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They've made it difficult for us to track them, Sigvard said, his voice strained from the cold. They've been covering their tracks. Thorvald glanced at him, his eyes narrowed. They're trying to buy time. We won't let them. As they reached the top of a ridge, Thorvald stopped and surveyed the land below. There, he pointed. In the distance, a small campfire flickered. That's where they are. I can feel it. Sigvard looked at the fire and then back at Thorvald, his expression hardening. Then we make our move tonight, he said. We end it. The group prepared to move under the cover of darkness, knowing the final confrontation was near. As the night deepened, Thorvald and his warriors moved silently toward the camp. The cold air bit at their skin, but their focus was unshaken. They knew what had to be done. As they approached the outskirts of the camp, Thorvald held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop. Stay low, he whispered. We strike at first light. The raider camp was quiet, with only a few sentries keeping watch. Thorvald's warriors crouched in the snow, weapons ready. Sigvard crouched beside him, his eyes scanning the camp. They don't expect us to come at night, Sigvard said softly. This will be our advantage. Thorvald nodded, his grip tightening on his axe. We take them down quickly. We can't let them regroup. The plan was simple. Strike fast, overwhelm them, and leave no room for escape. As the first rays of light began to break over the horizon, Thorvald gave the signal. Now! The raider camp erupted in chaos as Thorvald and his warriors attacked. The raiders, caught off guard, scrambled to grab their weapons, but Thorvald and Sigvard were already among them, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. For the north! Thorvald roared, his axe swinging with deadly accuracy. Sigvard's sword flashed in the early light, his movements swift and precise. The raiders were overwhelmed, their numbers too few to withstand the fury of Thorvald's warriors. The leader of the raiders, a large imposing figure, stood at the center of the camp, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won? The leader shouted, raising his sword. I will not fall so easily. But Thorvald, with fire in his eyes, charged at him. The two clashed in the center of the camp, their weapons ringing out against each other in the cold morning air. This would be the final fight.